Hello everyone, welcome back to another video on the Pick Me My Man channel. In today's video, I will be teaching you how to make basic player movement in Unity and add components to objects in Unity. So what you want to do is you want to open up the project that we made in the last video. You want to head over to the scene view. To look around, you want to use the right mouse button, sorry. I'm just going to reset that. Sorry, this is the second take of this video. But to look around, you want to use the right mouse button. You want to hold it down. To increase your movement speed, you want to use the scroll wheel while holding down the right mouse button. And then to move around, you want to use W, A, and D. You can speed it up, you can slow it down, just like so. So what we want to do is we want to create a floor for our player. So you want to go over to the hierarchy over here. A hierarchy is just another fancy word for a big list. Right click. You want to go over to the Create 3D Object, Plane. And then you want to go over to the Inspector tab over here, go to the Transform and then reset it by right clicking on Transform and then clicking on Reset. This just zeroes out the rotation and the position. Now, if we go over to the game view, we can see that we can't see anything because our camera is in our plane. To move the camera, what we want to do is we want to click on the Move tool up here or click W, which is the hotkey. Then we want to move it, by selecting the main camera in the hierarchy and then using this little button here which moves it on the X and the Y axis, the Z and the Y axis. I'm just going to move it over here, and then if we head back over to our game view, we can see our plane. I'm going to move it up a bit and then click on E or click on the rotation tool over here to rotate it down a bit. This just gives us a better view of our plane. Now, there is currently nothing on our plane and we want to add a cube which can rotate and has physics. So to do that, we want to go over to the scene view, right click on the hierarchy, click on 3D object, cube, and then as you can see it is not centered, it is not at 0, 0, so we want to go over to the transform and click on reset like we did for the plane. And now currently it has a box collider and a mesh renderer. The mesh renderer just lets us see the object and the collider just lets it collide with other objects. Same for the plane, if we select that, we've got the mesh collider and the mesh renderer. And then what we want to do to make our cube collide with the other object, we want to bring it up a bit by using the Move tool, and then to add a component, we want to go over to the Inspector tab and then click on Add Component. I'm going to type in Rigid Body, which is the physics system that Unity uses, and we want to click on Enter to add it. Now, if we move this up a bit, go to our game view, we can now see our cube floating above our plane. Now, because we have a collider, it can collide with the object, the plane, and because it has a rigid body physics component, it will then fall and then hit the plane. To view that, we're going to click on the play button up here and watch that in action. And as you can see, our cube now falls. So to make our cube rotate, we're going to close the game by clicking on the play button again, going over to our scene view, and then rotating the object. But we want to make it collide with other cubes, so to do that we want to click on Ctrl and D at the same time to duplicate it. D for duplicate. We want to move it down, move it this way, I'm going to move it very slightly backwards and then I'm going to zoom in on it. Then click on E or the rotate tool to rotate it on these axes, or you can use the sphere to rotate it. I'm going to click on R to access the scale tool or click on the scale in the tab over here. I'm going to scale this down a bit. I'm going to do Ctrl and D to duplicate it, move it down, move it over here, and then in the scale on the transform, I'm going to set that to 1, which is the default value, so from 0.7 to 1, 1 and 1. Like so, I'm going to then rotate it again. And then when we click on the game view and then click on play, because they are all a duplicate of the object that had the rigid body component, they all have physics. So if we click on play, we can all see these move and interact with each other. Like so. But what we want to do is we want to move our player. So we're going to exit the game view by clicking on the play button again. We're going to click on scene. And I'm going to get the cube, which is scaled to 1 by 1 by 1. I'm going to go over to the rotation and I'm just going to click on delete or backspace to zero it out on all the axes. I'm going to delete the other cubes I'm going to change the position on the X to 0. And then to change the Y, we can hover over the Y and then use our mouse to change it. Or we can click on the move tool and move it up and down. But we want to make our cube recognizable because currently it just blends in with the background and the floor. So to do that, I'm going to create a new folder to store our materials which we're going to assign. We're going to go over to the project tab, click on create, click on folder. I'm just going to call it maps, which means materials. I'm going to double click on the maps folder, right click, create, material. I'm going to name the material player. And I'm just going to make it a bright red color by going over to the inspector tab, going to base map, and then changing the color to bright red. Now we can't assign it in the game view, but if we go over to the scene, we can go to our project tab and then drag the player material to our cube, like so. Then I'm going to go back over to the game view, and what we want to do is we want to rename our cube by clicking F2 or going over to the name over here. I'm going to call it player with a capital P. Now currently all this cube is going to do is fall, but we want to make our player move in a certain direction. To do that, we're going to click on add component and we're going to name our script which we're going to create. I'm going to call it player movement. Click on new script, click on create and add. And then to open it, we want to make sure that we're using the correct code editor. And now to do that, we want to wait for it to load. Head over to the edit tab up here, click on preferences, and then in the external tools section, we want to go to the external script editor and make sure that Visual Studio 2022 is selected. Make sure the Open by File extension isn't enabled, otherwise Unity will not have the ability to read the variables or the names of certain things in our script. We installed Visual Studio 2022 in our last video when we were setting up our version of Unity. If you don't know what we're doing, head over to that video, which I will link in the description in a playlist, and you will be able to download the Visual Studio 2022 IDE and a version of Unity. So once we have the Visual Studio 2022 selected, I'm just going to click on the close button up here. And then to open up our script, we want to double click it on the inspector. It's going to open up in Visual Studio and it might be a little bit zoomed out, so to zoom in we want to hold down Control and use the scroll wheel to zoom in and out. So I'm going to scroll up a bit, and we want to create a new variable. A variable is simply a thing that we can change and modify which can apply to certain lines of code. So I'm going to create a new public variable, which means it will show in the inspector in the editor. Public rigid body. I'm going to call it player RB, which stands for player rigid body. Now the start function is simply a function which is called upon the startup. The // is a comment which is put there by the Unity engine by itself, and it tells you exactly what they do. Now the update function is called every frame, which is set here. And now what we want to do is we want to move our player. So we want to go over to the update function, we want to type in player RB, which is the name of our variable, and we want to add a force in a certain direction to our rigid body. So we're going to do player RB dot add force, like so. We want to click on this here. Then in two brackets, we want to create 0, 0, 0. Now these are three float values, or known as a vector 3. And now a vector 3, if we go back to the Unity editor, simply corresponds to the X, Y, and the Z axis. If we go over to the transform, we can see all of these moving, like so. You can click Ctrl and Z to undo. I probably should have mentioned that earlier, but if you want to undo something, just click Ctrl and Z, as I do not believe there is an undo button in Unity other than Ctrl and Z. So we're going to go over to the code editor again, and we want to add a force, and currently that force is 0. We want to go back over to Unity and find out which direction we want to add it in. In our case, it is the Z axis, which we can see up here. To change it, we can go over the Z and use our mouse to change it. We simply want to add a force, which moves our player forward. So, player RB.add force, I'm going to set it to something like 2. You can put an F at the end, which just simply identifies it as a float. Now, if you hover over the add force function, we can see that the x, y, and the z, or the 0, 0, and 2, are float values. And now that we've assigned it to 2, our player is going to move in a certain direction with a force of 2. Now obviously you can go back to the editor, click on play and watch it in action, but we want to be able to control our player speed from the inspector. So to do that, we're going to go underneath the public rigid body variable, create a new public float. We're going to call it player speed. And now because these values are floats and so is this, we can simply change the 2 to player speed. Oh my god, player speed, like so. And we're going to default the player speed equal to 2f. And now you have to add a semicolon to both the end of this line and the variables. It is a very important step in C# programming, which is the language that we are programming in for Unity. And now to save that, we want to click Ctrl and S or go up to File and then click on Save. So Ctrl and S to save. Then we're going to go back to Unity and we're going to change the player speed value and play the game to watch our player move forward. And now currently our plane is quite small. So to change that, I'm going to click on T, which opens up the Rect tool, which allows us to move our plane and scale it in any direction. Of course, you can click on R or the Scale tool and move it in this direction, but I'm going to click on T and move this forward. So when our player moves forward, it has more space to move around on. So if we go back to the game, click on our player, we can open up the player movement script, and we need to assign the player rigid body, so our player rigid body can be accessed by our script. To do that, we want to click on the rigid body component and then drag it simply down to the rigid body variable. Now when we click on play, we can see our player move forward with a force of 2. Like so. Our player will now move forward, but as you can see, our player rotates when he moves forward because the plane has friction which enables our player to rotate. There are a few different solutions to this. The solution that I will be using is freezing the rotation. So you want to head over to the rigid body component in the inspector, go over to the constraints and then freeze the rotation. I'm going to freeze it on the X, Y and the Z axes. And to make sure our plane is quite slippery, which also nullifies this effect, we want to go over to our project tab, right click, click on create, physics material. A physics material lets us change the friction and the bounciness of an object. I'm going to rename ours to floor. I'm not going to delete it, I'm going to save it as floor. And I'm going to change the dynamic friction to 0 and the dynamic or the static friction to 0. And now to assign it to our plane, we want to head over to the scene, select our plane, and then underneath the material in the mesh collider component, we want to assign the floor. Like so. Now the floor component or the floor physics material is assigned to the material variable. Now we're going to head over to the game, click on play, and we can now watch our player move forward very smoothly without rotating. Like so. Now, in the next tutorial video, I will be teaching you how to enable player movement by adding a input to the player. And I will be teaching you how to move in different directions. So, thank you for watching and I will see you in the next video. Bye bye.